Welcome to Polaris-Live, conversations on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers may ask questions using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. The upcoming United States presidential elections are being called the most important signal for the future direction of U.S. domestic and foreign policy in generations. Throughout this autumn, we will invite a select group of international experts to offer their views on the American elections and how countries around the world, especially China and the countries of the global South, are preparing for their outcome. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and my guest today is Ambassador Jorge Heine. Ambassador Jorge Heine is a lawyer, international relations scholar, and diplomat with a special interest in the international politics of the global South. Ambassador Heine is a research professor at Boston University's Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies. He has served as ambassador of Chile to China, India, and South Africa, and as a cabinet minister in the Chilean government. Ambassador Heine is widely published, including his latest bestseller, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Sarwar. Delighted to be with you, as always.
Thank you for that. Listen, the U.S. elections are only a month away. What is uppermost today, you think, on the minds of Latin American countries' peoples?
Well, I will say this. There has been a wide-ranging debate on the effects of the U.S. elections on the rest of the world. But I would say that particularly in the case of Latin America, there is concern about the announcements that have been made by former President Trump as to what he would do. He has announced that he would engage in massive deportations. More than half of the 11 million undocumented people in the United States are from Latin America. You can imagine the effect such a massive deportation program would have. President Trump has also announced tariffs from 10 to 20% on all goods imported by the United States. That would have a very serious effect on U.S.-Latin America trade. Senator Vance, his vice presidential candidate, has said that he would like to have the Mexican drug cartels declared as terrorist organizations, which would open the way for the U.S. freely attacking and bombing them. So all of this, doesn't look very encouraging. So there's great concern in Latin America about the outcome of the U.S. elections in November.
And I suppose it's even more frustrating, or must be even more frustrating and frightening to add to that, that both contenders of the U.S. presidency don't seem to be that far apart as far as tightening regulations. They may differ in words and so on. So I understand fully what you're saying. But let's extend our thinking to the countries of the global South. Is it possible to take this disparate group of but increasingly influential countries and try to project what's on the top of their mind, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, it's important to keep in mind the following. What we have seen in the course of the past 2 years, basically 2022 to 2024, is a real eruption of the global South into world affairs in a way that we had not seen before. In fact, Foreign Policy magazine at the end of 2023 asked the question, was 2023 the year of the global South? And it listed a number of articles that they published on the subject. So what I find very interesting is that some people question the very notion of global South and say, it's not there, it's very vague and so on. The fact is, it has come up with great force. It is an entity we must contend with. and those who deny their existence do so at that period. Now, that said, it's important to keep in mind that what we are seeing, and not just in the United States, I would say, we're also seeing this in Europe. There's a strong, what we might call chauvinist, isolationist, anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner reaction, which is basically against the peoples of the global south, people of color in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. So there's obviously concern about this very negative position that we are seeing, the rise of the far right in Germany, in France, elsewhere, all point in that same direction. So I would argue that what we are seeing is an increased cleavage between the global north and the global south. And that is something that is obviously present as well in the debates in the US election.
But the global south also has its own special interests, right? I mean, it's the India, for example, and South Africa, and so on. But are you suggesting that maybe as the years pass on, that they will coalesce as more than just a group of countries?
Well, there's the argument that is made that it is a very diverse group, and that would somehow lead to the notion that there is no such thing as the global south. Well, I think that is not quite the logical conclusion. It is important to understand what are we talking about when we talk about the global south. What we are talking about is the countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. That we're talking about 134 countries from the G77 at the UN. And these are the countries that feel left out from the high table of world politics. They have many differences. They have differences in income, difference obviously in language and economic development and so on. But they share the feeling of having been left out of the current international order. They don't have a place at the high table of international politics, and they would like to change that. You can see that, for example, in votes at the United Nations General Assembly calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Something like 140 countries vote in favor of that, 50 against. Who are the 140? Well, countries of the global south. Who are the 50 that vote against it? Countries in the global north. Seldom has that cleavage been so apparent.
Well, of course, what you're saying is the point of the spear, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But how do you think the global countries of the global south reconcile the fact that the global north still has the overwhelming military power? And as we are seeing now, especially in the Middle East, that raw power still calls the shots. Is this a point of friction? How are these countries thinking about this?
Well, no, look, there is no doubt that the number one military power in the world today, and will be so for a long time, is the United States. That is not at issue. At the same time, China is catching up. Russia is a nuclear power. There are other nuclear powers. So, it is a more complex picture. And the other thing you should keep in mind, this famous phrase, demography is destiny. The G7 makes up less than 10% of the world's population. The global south stands for the global majority. So, we should ask ourselves, which way is the world going? By 2050, it is estimated that of the top 10 economies, 7 will be non-Western ones. So, let's look at those long-term trends rather than just at, today's military balance.
Let me ask you something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. Mm-hmm. The liberal rules-based world order, as it's called, mm-hmm. It's existed now for 75 years. Mm-hmm. It set the guardrails, including creation of the United Nations, for how countries should act. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that world order is fading out. But what's next? What kind of order is phasing in? Not yet clear. Mm-hmm. And that's a dangerous time, isn't it?
Absolutely. The Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci put it best. He said that a crisis occurs when the old is dying and the new is not yet born. And that is exactly what we are living now. I would argue that what we are seeing in Gaza, which UNICEF has called a war against the children, 16,000 children have been killed in Gaza out of 40,000 people that have been killed in that war. And somehow, many countries in the West look at it with great equanimity. I find it most extraordinary that something like this can happen. And, particularly in the West, this is looked at as, well, sort of business as usual. In contrast to that, around the global South, this has been seen for what it is, something extremely tragic and extremely serious. As a result of that, Brazil has called for a ceasefire in the United Nations Security Council. As a result of that, South Africa has called on the International Court of Justice, putting on a case, arguing that Israel is in violation of the Convention Against Genocide. Nicaragua has taken Germany to the International Court of Justice, arguing that its supply of weapons to Israel is contributing to this genocide. So the reaction against what is happening in Gaza across the global South has been very strong.
And your point is well made. My question, though, still is that we are seeing the age-old adage of might makes right. And if I might ask you, I totally agree with you about the growing importance, the influence of the global South countries. What do you think they take away from this period? Because at some point, if we are correct, and I think we are, these countries will be in the setting up of fences and guidelines role. So what lessons are they taking away from this period today that you and I are living in?
Well, it's important to understand that within the global South, we have a new entity that has emerged in the past 15 years or so, and that is the BRICS countries. And the BRICS countries, originally formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, then was added to it, has become a very significant force. It is now formed by 10 countries. 4 new countries have joined it after the 15th BRICS summit held in Johannesburg last year. And the BRICS has its own bank. It now represents, something like 38% of the world's GDP measured in PPP terms, represents 46% of the world's population, 25% of world exports. So the BRICS is an entity that must be very seriously considered. And here there's an extraordinary development. I don't know whether you have followed it. Turkey, which is a NATO member and a country that has applied to join the EU, has now approached BRICS. It would like to join the BRICS. Now, this is a real turning point in international affairs. When you have a NATO member asking to join the BRICS, which is by many considered the main challenger to the West predominance, we are seeing how the world is changing and how non-alignment and what we, with my colleagues Fortino Minami in our book, have called active non-alignment is really coming up with great strength and with great force.
What is you've almost single-handedly defined this phrase and put it into the stream of foreign policy. Can you explain to our viewers briefly what the book is about, what the active non-alignment means? Can you tell us about that?
Of course. What active non-alignment is all about is for countries in the developing world not to let themselves be pushed around by Washington or by Beijing or by Moscow or Brussels and told what to do. What they do is they put their own interests front and center and act accordingly. They take each issue as it comes, evaluate it, and then make a decision, instead of saying we stand with Washington or we stand with Beijing no matter what. And that is what we're seeing more and more. This became particularly apparent in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The United States and the EU thought that everybody would side with the West and support Kiev. Well, that was not the case. And countries like India, like Pakistan, like South Africa took their own independent stance, and they have continued to do so. And this has become particularly apparent in the case of Western sanctions imposed on Russia. The overwhelming majority of countries in the developing world have rejected those sanctions. Why? Well, today it is Russia. Tomorrow it could be them. So, there's been a very strong reaction against these unilateral actions of the West. And if we add to that what I mentioned earlier about the great tragedy of the war in Gaza, we see how this is really coming together. Let me just underscore that South Africa, the new South African Foreign Minister, Mr. Ronald Lamola, recently gave a speech in which he officially announced that South Africa's foreign policy is that of active non-alignment. If we look at Vietnam, of course, has been espousing what they call bamboo diplomacy, which is a very flexible diplomacy that allows Vietnam to have good relations with China, with the United States, and with Russia. Mind you, in the span of a few months, Vietnam did what no other country has done. It hosted the visits of President Biden, President Putin, and President Xi. I mean, wow. that takes some doing. It is the product of what Vietnam calls bamboo diplomacy, which is, for all intents and purposes, the equivalent of what we argue is active non-alignment.
Let me, Mr. Ambassador, take a few moments to remind viewers that Polaris-Live is entirely viewer-supported. We'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at kashmeri.com, which is KASHMERI.com, and to our YouTube channel, which is www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really does help us. Now, Ambassador Heine, I want to ask you, as today's dominant powers that help set up the existing liberal, human rights-based world order, aren't Western countries the natural guides to take us into the next world order? Or do you think that important equation has changed because of the global South?
I think that equation has changed. I think that the leadership that was exercised by countries like the United States and the United Kingdom in the period immediately after World War II has really faded very quickly. And let me give you only an example. In the first decade of the new century was called by some the decade of the BRICS, because in a very difficult decade that was bookended by 9/11 first, and then by the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the one sort of positive development that took place was the rise of the BRICS, of these, newly emerging rising powers. Curiously enough, by 2015, 2016, you read the commentaries in the leading international press and scholarly journals, the consensus was that the BRICS were passé, that they had seen their best moment in the sun, but now was the time for the so-called serious countries to take charge again and manage global governance, like the United States, like the United Kingdom. Well, what happened? In June of 2016, we had, of course, the Brexit referendum in the UK. And the UK spent the next 4 years trying to sort out the mess that was Brexit. The United Kingdom has had 6 prime ministers in the course of the past 8 years. I don't know if that is a model of stability or the sort of country that can actually lead the rest of the world when it can hardly manage its own affairs. And of course, in the case of the United States in 2016 proceeded to elect Mr. Trump as president. The first thing he did was to quit the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He then quit the Paris Accords. He then quit the World Health Organization in the midst of the worst pandemic in 100 years. Now, is that the sort of leadership that the world expects and needs to sort its very serious challenges? I would beg to differ.
You've brought up the question of the United Nations, and obviously the heart as far as security relations are concerned is the Security Council. And it seems to a lot of observers, including me, that the Security Council is becoming increasingly inconsequential to its founding role. Do you agree with that? And if so, how can something be done to reform the Security Council? It almost sounds impossible, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. No, you're quite right. And what is more, you have this running situation. I was in New York last week and was also in New York in September of 2023. And what struck me as most extraordinary is that here you have the P5, the five permanent members of the Security Council. The United States, China, Russia, France, and the UK. Of those 5 countries, the only head of state that was present at the opening of the General Assembly, both in 23 and in 24, was President Biden, who is, of course, president of the host country of the United Nations headquarters. None of the others deemed it, necessary to do so. And in 2023, in September, also took place the G20 summit in New Delhi. There, 3 of the P5 heads of state and government were present. What does that tell you? It tells you that the UN is becoming increasingly irrelevant. When the heads of state of the leading countries in the world skip the opening of the UN General Assembly, but do go to a meeting like that of the G20 in New Delhi, it tells you that the world is moving in a different direction. So, in 2024, to have 2 Western European nations as part of the P5, and no country from Africa and no country from Latin America as part of that group, it seems to me it tells you something, and it tells you that there's something very wrong with any entity that can operate that way. And it's part of the reason, of course, why the UN is becoming increasingly irrelevant.
I want to ask you, kind of tongue in the cheek, about a recommendation made by someone who you may know, Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore, and he proposes that for the good of the world, England, the UK, should give up its seat to India. I don't think that'll ever happen, but what do you make of that?
Well, Kishore Mahbubani is a good friend of mine. We had him here at BU giving our annual lecture at the Pardee Center. Yes, you're quite right. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. But, he is making an important case. There's something very wrong with an entity like the P5 that does not include India. India right now is the most populous country in the world. It surpassed China. And it deserves a place at the table. In many ways, I would argue, I was ambassador to India and had a very, extraordinary experience there. In many ways, New Delhi is the capital of the global South. And the notion that it doesn't have the place at the table that it merits is very disturbing.
Improving relations between the United States and China is at the heart of what Polaris-Live tries to do. And I want to ask you, if you could talk privately for a few minutes to both President Xi Jinping and the next president of the United States, what are a couple of recommendations you'd make to them to improve U.S.-China relations and influence the world in transforming or aiding in the transformation of the order?
Sure. Well, I would say this. A significant concern in the countries of the Global South is that the world is facing enormous challenges. These challenges arise from climate change. They arise from water scarcity. They arise from massive human displacements. They arise from food scarcity. They arise from mass migration. They arise from international organized crime. These are very important global challenges that are coming together to such a degree that, there's a recent book out called Polycrisis, arguing, that you have all these simultaneous crises that they feed on each other. Yet, here we have China and the United States, focusing on what? China on expanding its footprint on the South China Sea and adding more naval bases and more, military bases in the South China Sea. And the United States focusing on banning Chinese electric vehicles from the United States. I mean, I think it's madness. They are not focusing on the big picture. And between China and the United States, they represent 40% of the world's GDP. So, 4 out of every 10 goods and services that produced in this world come out of China and the United States. So if they were to put their minds together and try to solve and address some of these problems, instead of focusing on the petty squabbles, the world would make tremendous progress.
Thank you for that. And let me end by asking you, what is on top of your mind as far as your research and thinking and intellectual exercise? What is the one thing that you are thinking about that you can tell us?
Well, I would argue very strongly, Sarwar, that we are living at a time of a very significant change in world politics, that the world that we saw from 1945 roughly, I would say, till 2015, 2016, is changing very quickly. It is moving in a different direction, and it is moving in the direction of which the global South is pointing to, and we are going to see a lot more of the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, exercising the sort of leadership role that was exercised in the past by countries in the West.
Well, your words are very, very timely for me personally. I'm spending the rest of this week at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, where annually, and this will be the 75th year, Mr. Ambassador, they organize a conference where they bring 200 students from around the U.S., also Canada and some other countries, to West Point to mix with the cadets and to mix with the officers and talk about important issues that face the world. And I'll be helping coordinate a roundtable on U.S.-China, Indo-Pacific relations. I will take your words to them, your closing words to them. So I thank you very much. And I want to thank you again, as we have run out of time, for again coming back to Polaris Live. So a deep thank you.
Have a good day.
And let me also thank all the other viewers from around the world for being part of our program today. Please continue to watch Polaris Live, and until we meet again, goodbye.